Hey, welcome everybody. I'm Garry Adelman. That's Kris White behind the camera. You're with the American Battlefield Trust, and we're sort of between battlefields now, and we're between Rev War battlefields here on Manhattan Island, but we're here to cover Civil War New York, and I can't think of a better place to start than right here in Union Square, right after the firing on Fort Sumter. It couldn't have been a larger spectacle, the greatest demonstration ever seen or heard in America up to that time, where 200,000 people come here to see 20 dignitaries, but mainly the Civil War's first hero in the North, Major, now General, Robert Anderson, comes to roil up the crowd to help Abraham Lincoln get his 75,000 soldiers. It's a massive crowd. So that was in 1861. A little bit later in the war, you're going to have a real need coming about for soldiers. So you're going to have the legendary Metropolitan Sanitary Fair here in Union Square, raising almost $1 million. That's almost $18 million now for soldiers, for the care of the troops, and for medical supplies. Not long after that, the flag of the 20th U.S. Colored Troops is presented here in Union Square. Not long after that, you have Abraham Lincoln. There's a service here, massive service here in Union Square. This is just a taste of what we have going on in New York City. We're going to see as many places as we can in the time we have allowed, and we hope you enjoy. All right, here we are at one of at least my meccas here. We are on Broadway. We're right near Franklin Street. We're in New York City, and here we are at the shrine of a place, at least for people like me. That is Mathew Brady's original photo studio. And say original, I mean, he did have one in the 1840s over on Fulton Street, but from mid-1850s and onward, for a long while, this is his photo studio, and this was the place to be. If you could imagine the best branding person you've ever heard of nowadays, it would be Mathew Brady. Everything was luxurious. He knew how to brand himself and his photos, and he happened to take excellent photos. You would go into this building behind me, you would be greeted with an unbelievable gallery. You'd have a gallery of Americans, you'd have art, you'd have everything under the sun there, and they would lure you in, and then maybe you'd meet with somebody who worked there, and you'd go up to the studio itself. You might pass by the processing and the printing rooms, the chemical rooms on your way, and then you would actually figure out what you're going to do, and then when they're all ready, you're going to go up to the top floor way up there, which has a skylight up there in the roof, and you are going to have the magic made, the magic of wet plate or tintype photography. Photo by Brady, and you could have incredible things done. It would be hard to find a place anywhere on the planet where more important Civil War figures were, including Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, including Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, George Gordon Meade, George Thomas, every practically important United States soldiers, and a good number of Confederate soldiers, P.G.T. Beauregard and others as well, walked those steps and went into that building there. Perhaps the most famous connection with this site is when Abraham Lincoln came here in 1860, February of 1860. He's trying to get some sort of a presidential run started. He's not doing too well. That is, until he came here and Brady worked with him to make him look less elongated, maybe shrink his neck so it would look in the camera, and later, combined with a speech he would give not far from here, he would supposedly say, Mathew Brady and the Cooper Union made me president.
All right, so we made our way up from Mathew Brady's studio, and we're on to the other iconic location that is tied to Abraham Lincoln and his visit here in February of 1860, and that's the Cooper Union. Even though it's in construction behind me, the building itself, Peter Cooper, who sits upon his throne behind us, founded a school here in 1859. That statue was done by Auguste St. Gaudens. His first statue was actually ever done here in New York City was David Glasgow Farragut's statue, but that's Peter Cooper. He creates the Cooper Union. When Abraham Lincoln comes here, not quite yet as a presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 1860, his goal is to come here, deliver a 7,000-word address in Harriet Beecher's Plymouth Church. But he is going to be moved over here to the Cooper Union because there's 1,500 seats here in the Cooper Union. That makes it one of the largest event spaces in New York City at the time. So he'll come in here, and he will also have other very famous political figures at the time. A guy named Cassius Clay, no, not the boxer, the man from Kentucky. Frank Blair Sr., his son goes on to become Missouri governor as well as a corps commander in the Army of the Tennessee. and then we'll have Abraham Lincoln rise to speak. And he's going to deliver a speech in 7,000 words in basically 3 different sections. And those sections will explore the expansion of slavery into the territories. Lincoln will essentially state that he doesn't want to deal with any of the existing states and their slavery, but those territories, that's where we need to deal with it. Then he is going to have kind of a comedic play between himself, arguing between the Republican Party and the South, and then he'll kind of wrap all of that up at the end into his 3rd and final section, which will kind of deliver his ideas on what will be his presidential candidacy here. The next day, on February 28th, 1860, that 7,000 word speech is going to run in newspapers here in New York City and then take off across the nation. And that is when it'll launch Abraham Lincoln into his political career that will send him to the White House. In May of 1860, on the 3rd ballot in the Wigwam up in Chicago, he becomes the Republican presidential candidate for 1860 and, of course, our 16th president of the United States. All right, we're making our way around New York City, and we're on 12th Street over here in New York, and the house behind me is the reason we're here. That was the home of Winfield Scott. He's the commanding general of the United States Army when the Civil War begins. He actually buys the townhouse behind me in April of 1853 for about $26,000. Today, that's about $970,000. So you're talking about almost $1 million for New York property even back in the day. But Winfield Scott is that guy that most people make fun of for how large he is. He's known as Old Fuss and Feathers when the Civil War starts. But he's a veteran of the War of 1812, he's a veteran of Mexico, and according to Sir Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the guy who beat Napoleon, he said that Winfield Scott was the greatest soldier of their age. So Winfield Scott knew what he was talking about. He'll survive the American Civil War. He'll die in 1866. He's from Virginia, but comes up here and spends his time in New York and fights for the Union during the American Civil War, although Winfield Scott doesn't go out and see active field service. His Anaconda Plan is eventually what U.S. Grant and many other U.S. generals will implement as the war goes on between 62, 63, 64, and 65, slowly strangling the South and eventually bringing victory for the North. Hey everybody, we're now along 5th Avenue here in New York City, and behind me was the site of where Dan Sickles' house once stood. You know Dan Sickles. He's the Union 3rd Corps commander at Gettysburg, moves forward without orders to the Peach Orchard, the Wheatfield Devil's Den, the Emmitsburg Road, all those places are made famous. You also probably know he's from New York City. He goes to New York University, NYU, becomes a lawyer, studies under Ben Butler. No, not that Ben Butler, another Ben Butler. And becomes very active in the early political scene here in New York City. He marries a much younger woman named Teresa Bagioli, and he is going to go on to infamy in 1859 when he murders, though he's acquitted for it, Francis Scott Key's son, Philip Barton Key. Eventually, after the American Civil War, he comes back to New York City, then becomes the minister to Spain, may have had an affair with the former Queen of Spain. We never know with Dan Sickles. His life is pretty interesting, and he's a very interesting character that you should learn more about through one of the best books I know about it by Jim Hessler. Then we have Dan Sickles coming back here to live. He's in the New York State Senate before the war. After the war, he's a congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives. Then he goes on to the New York Monuments Commission at Gettysburg, where he's eventually booted off the commission for maybe embezzling about $27,000 worth of money. And that would also have put up his statue in the Excelsior Brigade statue out in Excelsior Field at Gettysburg. But Dan Sickles, he is one of those characters you love to hate. Even at the time, he was talked about by his other generals. He was called by one of them a sissy. Another one will say that he has a high-pitched voice, like a guy who's trying to make himself sound more important. And a lot of people at the time loved Dan Sickles, hated Dan Sickles. I don't know what you think about him. He always entertains me, and I'd love to get to know a little bit more about Dan Sickles, and that's where his house once stood here in New York City.
Here we are standing at 3rd Avenue and 46th Street, and I don't have much to show you here because, you know, it was burned during the Civil War. This is one of the many scenes of the New York draft riots. This is 1863. Union soldiers were not specifically used to being conscripted into the Union Army there, and all of a sudden they're going to gather here at the 7th District draft office, and they're going to start reading off names, picking them out of a big wheel. And here you have, pretty peaceful first day. By the second day, people realizing that you could buy your way out of the draft for $300. By the way, imagine, do you have $8,000 to $10,000 lying around when only half of Americans have more than $400 in their bank account today? That's what the middle and lower class Americans were facing when they could see the rich buying their way out of the Civil War, a rich man's war and a poor man fight. They got more and more worked up as it went around, and it turned into a riot, a particularly deadly and destructive riot that fell, of course, largely on New York's black community here. Hundreds are left homeless, a bunch are killed. Eventually, the Union Navy comes in and fires broadsides into the city. Oh no, wait, that's in the gangs of New York. That didn't actually happen, but troops from New York, straight from the Battle of Gettysburg, do come here and calm down the riot, and eventually peace is restored. It is it's said to be just about the largest and most destructive, bloodiest riot in all of American history.
And we finish our tour of Civil War New York here at arguably the most iconic spot, and that will be the tomb of Ulysses S. Grant. Sitting high above the Hudson River off to my right is the 150-foot mausoleum to the former General-in-Chief, as well as the 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is a man who rose from obscurity to command all the federal forces and to become United States President. He's a West Point graduate of the class of 1843. He goes on to fight in the Mexican-American War, and prior to the war, he is known to some as an alcoholic. He's known to some as a failure. He tries many business ventures, and things don't go well for him. But when the Civil War begins, Ulysses S. Grant finds his calling. At places like Shiloh, Chattanooga, Vicksburg, and engaging with Robert E. Lee in the famed 1864 Overland Campaign that culminated in the Appomattox surrender of Robert E. Lee's vaunted Army of Northern Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant becomes a household name. That household name will carry him to become the 18th President of the United States. But after his presidency, Ulysses S. Grant made some poor business decisions. Some of it was him led astray by family members and friends. In the last few years of his life, Grant was battling throat cancer, and in his final weeks, he was trying to finish his memoirs, a masterpiece of writing that he left to us, the American people. But more importantly, he needed the $50,000 that came along with writing those memoirs. Grant writes those memoirs, and within the last 2 weeks of his life, finishes them. And he will die on July 23rd, 1885 at his cottage in Mount McGregor, New York. The mayor of New York City offers Julia Dent Grant, Grant's wife, to have his body interred here in New York. On August 8th, 1885, the general is placed here behind me, not in the mausoleum that you see, but in an early mausoleum. In 1892, the mausoleum that you see behind me is actually started its construction. For the next 5 years, this impressive 150-foot structure comes to life. On April 27th, 1895, Ulysses S. Grant is laid to rest inside of the tomb. There's the old adage of who's actually buried inside of Grant's tomb. That's the old joke. Because Julia Dent Grant and Ulysses S. Grant are both in sarcophagi above the ground, not buried in the ground, technically there's no one buried in Grant's tomb. So if you ever have a chance to, we encourage you to come up here and experience the site high above the Hudson River. And the very apropos motto that is above the door, let us have peace. Though Grant is remembered as a warrior, he's remembered by some who helped the civil rights movement and tried to put the country back together again after the bloody and costly American Civil War. So I encourage you to come up to New York, and you can see the other sites that are associated with Civil War New York. It's not just the draft riots. It's not just Grant's tomb. You can see the statues to men like Philip Henry Sheridan, William Henry Seward, and you can also see the Cooper Union where Abraham Lincoln gave his famous address in 1860. You can see Mathew Brady's former studio, and of course, you can see the home of Winfield Scott, one of the greatest soldiers of his age. Civil War New York is more than these two sites, so get up here, experience it, click the like button, click subscribe, and please keep supporting battlefield preservation and education.